Hello ladies and gents, and welcome to part 2 of our 2 videos on the 1302 Anglo-Scottish Truce, and particularly this issue of Bruce using the truce to switch sides from the Scots to the English. Now, for those of you that missed the first part of these 2 videos, I'll put a link in the description below, so do feel free to go and check that out before we go any further, because today we're going to have a look at the way in which that truce, and particularly that defection, if that's what you want to call it, the defection of Bruce from the Scots to the English, was dealt with in subsequent histories. We're going to have a look at 3 medieval sources, medieval Scottish sources, to see how the Scots that were kind of nearly contemporary with Bruce dealt with this issue, and then we're going to have a look at 2 modern depictions of Bruce's time in English allegiance, and see if we can find any similarities or make any contrasts between the ways in which these different works have looked at Bruce's time as an Englishman. So the first of our 3 medieval sources we're going to have a look at is Barbers Bruce. So in the 1370s, a chap called John Barber, Archdeacon of Aberdeen, produces a long narrative poem purporting to recount the sort of life and times of Robert the Bruce and some of the key figures surrounding him. Now, this is my very raggy and dog-eared copy from when I did my PhD. Barber was writing, as I say, in the 1370s, possibly under the patronage of Bruce's grandson, Robert II, or possibly under the patronage of some other key figures within the Scottish political community. But undoubtedly he was writing for a predominantly noble audience, a predominantly aristocratic audience, and for an audience that contained the offspring or the very close descendants of the individuals that he was writing about, including Robert Bruce. So he's writing for an audience that had very much had a vested interest in having the life of Bruce and the lives of his cohorts lionized and their reputations enhanced. Now, Barber deals with Bruce's time in English captivity, in English allegiance, wasn't forced into it. Barber deals with Bruce's time as an Englishman simply by ignoring it. Barber actually conflates Robert Bruce, King Robert I of Scotland, our Robert Bruce, with his grandfather, Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale, sometimes known as Bruce the Competitor. Barber presents Robert I, the man who would be Robert I, as the man who, in the early 1290s, had competed with John Balliol to be King of Scots, has Balliol inaugurated as King of Scots, and then booted off the throne when the English invade in 1296, and then Barber leaps from 1296 and the English invasion and occupation of Scotland right to the issues surrounding Bruce's confrontation with Comyn at Dumfries in 1306. We'll be looking at that event in a little bit more detail later in the month, when the anniversary of that comes along. So Barber, in effect, redacts the period 1296 to 1306. He just excises it altogether from his history of Robert Bruce, and thereby neatly avoids ever having to deal with that awkward fact that Bruce spent the period from 1302 to 1306 in English allegiance. So that's Barber in the 1370s. If we leap another 70 years into the future, to the 1440s, we then find a chap called Walter Bower, who is the abbot of Inchcombe. Inchcombe is a little island with an abbey on it out in the Firth of Forth. In the 1440s, Abbot Bower produces an enormous tome of Scottish history, taking the story of Scotland basically from the creation of the world right the way through to his own time. This chronicle is known as the Scotic Chronicon. Very, very important and influential piece of work. Bower, again, is writing for a fairly high-class audience. He's notionally writing the Scotic Chronicon, in fact, for the benefit of James II, who is the young King of Scots at the time, still a minor at this time. Notionally, what Bower is trying to do is draw together a whole host of disparate sources on Scottish history to produce one long narrative of Scottish history that is intended, supposedly, for the edification of the young king. Now, Bower, unlike Barber, does acknowledge that Bruce spent some time in English allegiance, but Bower uses this as an opportunity to draw together Bruce and another one of the significant figures from Scotland's early 14th century history, William Wallace. Bower acknowledges that Bruce fought for the English and served the English, but he presents Wallace as having provided for Bruce the inspiration, the impetus, and a model that brought Bruce from the English side back into Scottish allegiance. Now, this is very, very important because, as we're going to see, this has an enormous influence on subsequent histories of the period. Because if we leap now from the 1440s to the 1470s, so another 30 years into the future, we then come to another long narrative poem, this time about William Wallace, known as Blind Harry's The Wallace. This is again my copy that I used for my PhD. Now, Blind Harry was a somewhat obscure figure in the grand scheme of things, but he is essentially writing the Wallace, this long narrative poem, very much in the style of Barber, and very much to do for Wallace what the Bruce had previously done for Robert Bruce. Now, Harry very much takes his inspiration and his influence from Bower when it comes to this issue of Bruce's time in English captivity. Sorry, not in English captivity, I will keep saying that. In English allegiance. Harry takes what Bower has to say about Wallace being the kind of inspiration behind Bruce switching sides and runs with it. He expands on it quite significantly. And in a sense, he models, he frames Wallace's entire career as being an effort to try to show Bruce the way, to show Bruce what he should be doing as King of Scots, rather than serving the English and fighting for the English. If he behaved more like Wallace does in his role as guardian, Bruce could become, and of course by the end of the poem does become, the King of Scots that the kingdom needs to deliver it from the tyranny of the English. So those are our medieval examples. That's the kind of medieval historiography of Bruce's time in English service. Very obviously sort of foreshortened and you know, a potted version of it. But those are the three main sources I would draw your attention to for seeing how Bruce's time in English allegiance was understood in the medieval period. But we are unusually lucky in this case, because within the last 20 or so years, and in fact, no, 30 or so years, and in one case, within the last 6 months or so, we have had two very popular, very prominent depictions of Bruce's time in English allegiance on the big screen. First of all, we're back in 1995, which sadly is more than 20 years ago now. Back in 1995 we had the film Braveheart, award-winning film, hugely popular and influential. And then in, I believe it was October last year, it was released, at Netflix's Outlaw King. Both of these films, very, very popular. Both of them provide us with modern depictions of Bruce's time as an Englishman. So, just to sort of bring us to the end of this video, I want to have a quick look at those two interpretations. Now, in the case of Braveheart, we will do more in-depth videos on Braveheart further down the line, I can assure you. But for the purposes of this exercise, looking at Bruce in Braveheart, just very quickly, Bruce is presented as very much the reluctant Englishman. He is presented as, in effect, being goaded into serving the English by his father, who is a very different figure in Braveheart than he seems to have been in real life. And when Bruce sees Wallace, and particularly when he starts building a relationship with Wallace, we'll definitely do more detailed analysis of the relationship between Bruce and Wallace in Braveheart, hashtag Brawless, for those of you at home who know what that means. But in Braveheart, as Bruce gets to know Wallace, gets to see what Wallace is doing, and gets to know you know, the man who Wallace is, gradually he starts to change his ways. He's drawn back into Scottish allegiance, and ultimately is inspired to lead the Scots to their ultimate victory over the English at Bannockburn, which is right at the end of the film. Spoilers, I suppose, for anyone who hasn't watched Braveheart. Now, hopefully you can all see there that this jives very strongly with Bauer and Harry's interpretation of things, particularly Harry's. Now, Randall Wallace, who wrote the script for Braveheart, has made no mystery of the fact that he was, to a considerable extent, inspired to produce the script for Braveheart by having read Harry's Wallace. So it shouldn't be too surprising that Braveheart follows Harry's lead in that regard. When we come a little bit closer to our own time again, to just last October 2018, we have the release of Netflix's Outlaw King, which again gives us a depiction of Bruce's time serving the English. Now, before I go any further, I should announce, I suppose, a degree of conflict of interest here. I actually did do some historical consultancy work for Outlaw King. So, when I say that Outlaw King gives us a more historically accurate depiction of Bruce's time in English allegiance than Braveheart, you are perfectly within your rights to take that with a pinch of salt, I suppose. However, I will add to that although we get a more historically accurate depiction of Bruce's time as an Englishman in Outlaw King, there are still some notable inaccuracies. Again, we see Bruce presented as being the reluctant Englishman, that phrase I used before. He submits to Edward I right at the beginning of the film, but does so reluctantly, does so 2 years after he did in real life, that foreshortening, possibly for dramatic reasons rather than out of an unwillingness to, you know, out of a desire to shave 2 years off Bruce's time as an Englishman. But again, as we saw yesterday, this doesn't necessarily jive well with the facts as we know them. It's not really clear that Bruce is coerced into being English in 1302 when he switches sides. It actually suits Bruce's purposes really in 1302 to come over to the English. In Outlaw King we see the marriage of Bruce to Elizabeth as being a reward for him switching sides, not something that he's actively pursuing in his decision to change sides. And again, it's not emphasized as much in Outlaw King as it is in Braveheart, but again we see this implication, this suggestion that the model provided by Wallace has to some extent been an inspiration for Bruce's decision to come back, or eventually come back from English allegiance to Scottish allegiance, and of course to take up the mantle of king and start his you know, great patriotic struggle to free Scotland. Now, just to wrap up, there are a few things that I think are interesting here and are worthy of you know, thinking about beyond the end of this video. Two things I think in particular emerge from looking at these these 5 depictions altogether. First of all, when we look at those modern depictions of Bruce's time in English allegiance and compare them to those medieval depictions, particularly of course Bower and Harry's, we still see that the medieval historiography is affecting the way you know, popular dramatized depictions of Bruce's time in English captivity are put together. You know, particularly Bower and Harry's notion that you know, at one time the patriotic struggle was Wallace's and eventually he hands it over, or it is taken up by Robert Bruce. This still carries weight. So although we're not necessarily always getting historically accurate depictions in our dramatized versions of Bruce's time in English captivity, we are at least seeing the medieval explanations for Bruce's equivocal behaviour, I suppose, in the early 14th century. We are still seeing these medieval explanations of that having an impact on these modern dramatized representations. The other thing that I think is quite interesting to note is that even now there's still a sense, when it comes to presenting these ideas in a dramatized setting, that Bruce's time in English captivity is something that has to be explained and really excused. You know, Bruce can't switch sides from the Scots to the English because he's pursuing his ambitions and it suits him better to be English for a bit in 1302 than it does to be Scottish anymore, which is probably closer to the actual truth of the matter. He has to be reluctant, he has to be bullied into it by his father, or he has to be doing it now pragmatically because everybody is doing it and there's nobody left in Scotland with a willingness to fight against the domineering English. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's good, bad or indifferent. I just think those are some interesting ideas that emerge when we look at these different depictions all together, like that. That's probably about it for me for this video. I do hope you've enjoyed watching. I'm not sure what the next video is going to be about. I did mention before we have I think the next anniversary post is going to be Bruce versus Common at Dumfries. But I would like to get some more thematic videos out in the meantime. So I'm not sure when that's going to be or what form it's going to take. But I hope you've enjoyed this, and hopefully I'll see you for the next one. Thank you, folks.